Hey Internet, it's Phil, and today we're doing something a little bit different. We're doing a podcast. I am joined here by my friend Andy, and we're going to talk about RPGs. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself and the topic that you came up with?
Yes, so I'm Andy. I go by Advisor Cloud Online if you find me around anywhere. I've been playing RPGs not super long actually, probably since about 2010. But after playing a bit of Final Fantasy XIV with Phil, and we also talked about Final Fantasy XV together extensively, I thought it might be interesting since I play a lot of Western-style RPGs of various kinds, and Phil plays lots of Japanese RPGs, if we had a discussion about the differences and similarities between them.
Yeah, and it's not like a competition kind of thing. Like I think they're both great, even though I vastly prefer one. I think it's interesting to talk about the differences because it's a different style of game, really, and it's just different sensibilities. But I think it'll be cool because I pretty much I would say almost exclusively play JRPGs. Like I'm a big Final Fantasy guy, and I just for some reason Western RPGs just don't do it for me. Even if I think they're cool, like I have one friend specifically that plays tons of them. Like he played Baldur's Gate when we were younger, and I watched him play through things like Skyrim and in Dragon Age, and they look really cool. And I just can't imagine myself playing them. But we'll talk about some of the specific reasons why. Before we get into the talking points we had, I read something earlier tonight that I thought was really interesting, and I was looking up kind of other discussions people have had on this topic, and I found someone that was saying, actually a few people that were saying that one of the major differences in Japanese and Western RPGs is that even though they came from the same place, which was Dungeons and Dragons, like in the 80s, D&D got really big in Japan, and that's where like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy came from. And it's the same deal here with things like Ultima. The difference is that here, they developed RPGs for the computer. And in Japan, they developed RPGs for the NES. And the difference in resources was huge. Like there was a lot more limit on what you could do with an NES and what you could do with a computer even then. And so that might explain why some of the like complexity in the systems of Western RPGs kind of stuck, and Japanese ones focused more on story. And I'd never
Yeah,
really thought about that before.
yeah, I mean, if you look at the sort of subgenre of Western RPGs that goes under CRPG, that's computer RPG, which kind of started with Baldur's Gate in that style of game.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a few different things that we kind of noticed when we were just talking, trying to figure out how we would cover this topic. And one thing that we noticed was that the protagonist is I think one of the main differences in Western and Japanese RPGs, because their approach typically, obviously there's going to be exceptions to everything, but typically the approach to a main character is way different. And it wasn't even something I really noticed until it was pointed out to me. But in Japanese RPGs, you have usually a set character. You have a specific person who has a history, they have a specific skill set, and that's who you play. And kind of the meaning of role playing in a Japanese RPG is that you are given a role and you play it. But that's not really how Western RPGs work. It's a lot more like individual focused.
Yeah, I was messing around in the Pillars of Eternity character creation the other day, and sort of offhandedly out of curiosity, I did a quick rough estimate of how many different characters you could create, not accounting for the different ways you could distribute your stat points, and it was something like 48,000 or whatever.
That's crazy. 48,000?
That also doesn't take into account the appearances you can use.
See, that stresses me out. And that's how you know that I grew up on JRPGs, because I want you to give me a character. I want them to have some sort of backstory, and then I'll go and I can relate to that character as long as they're compelling. But like, give me the character creator. I get paralyzed by choice. That's a big thing for me. I get paralyzed by choice, and there's so many choices in Western RPGs I can't deal with it.
I love that part of it. And part of it's because, I guess, mechanically, I sometimes am a bit of a brewer and like to see where the system can do weird things.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, you can do that, and then sometimes that naturally flows into playing a really interesting character.
Yeah, it's cool. Well, the nice thing is, like, you can play a different character every time.
Yeah.
Like Fallout, I always want to approach in different ways, but because I'm a creature of habit, every one of my Fallout characters is like a tough but fair lady who like she goes against the law, but she always does the right thing. And like it, and even if I try to play an evil character, I can't be mean in games. I just have to make the same character every time.
Everyone has a favorite, I think, and that's kind of their go-to whenever they're not sure what else to do. And sometimes it heavily depends on the game, because I'm kind of like you in that when I play a game, I'm not always necessarily the most fair, but I'm generally playing a pretty nice guy.
Right.
But then if you give me a game like Tyranny, then, suddenly I end up basically killing everybody, sometimes in like really horrific ways, and it's just because of how the game plays out, and they do a good job of making it feel good to be bad.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, that game is Saints Row 3 and 4. Like, those were the games where I could just relax and do whatever I wanted and just be awful. And I think it was because in an RPG, if I'm really mean to someone, I feel like there's more of a consequence. In Saints Row, you can like run over your allies and they don't care and you don't get punished for it. Like, the police will come after you, but it doesn't matter. But like, I don't want to hurt someone's feelings. Like, in Fallout, I can't be really mean to someone that I know doesn't deserve it, because then I feel bad as a person, which is just kind of funny, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really a lot of consequence to it in Saints Row, and that's entirely the reason, like, the purpose they made it with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because it's not an RPG, I can be mean. But like in a situation where I'm invested and I feel like I am the character, like I just find it really hard to make those choices. So I only ever see like the angel side of games with like a alignment system.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the things Tyranny does well about that is they don't really track your alignment on that kind of scale. What they do is with all your party members and then all the different groups in the game, and some important people, they basically just track separately how much they like you or how much you've pissed them off. Or in terms of your party members, it's one track is their loyalty and the other one's their fear, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can have someone that would like absolutely go out there and die for you as soon as you ask them to, but then they're also terrified because they think that you might do that sometime.
See, I enjoy that because in Fallout 3, I was almost always like the good guy. But then there was one mission where I think the rich guy Tenpenny, I think, is trying to like take over a tower, or he already has the tower, and like a bunch of ghouls want to move in. And I either got all the ghouls killed or got all the people killed. I don't remember which one I did. But the radio guy, for the rest of the game, every time he would praise me, eventually he'd get back to that event and he'd call me a scumbag for what accidentally happened there. And I was like, I feel like it was a black and gray situation. That's not the phrase. It was a morally gray situation. Like, I didn't understand exactly the consequence of my actions. And I felt like that binary of him being like, you were an angel who's saving the wasteland, but F you for killing all these people. Like,
you're perfect except for this one thing. Go to hell.
Yeah, like the binary is sometimes a little much for me. And I know like the Star Wars games I think are like that too. Where like if you go with the light side of the force, you have like a halo, and if you go with the dark side, you like literally grow horns and like your skin turns red. Like,
yeah. And I've noticed that sort of system has fallen out of favor in Western RPGs lately, and that's something I kind of appreciate because...
Do you think Mass Effect was like the death knell of that? Like the ending of it?
I think it was definitely the start, because, I mean, part of the reason that the Paragon and Renegade system worked the way it did in that game is because, sort of like the JRPG, you were given Shepard as a protagonist to play as, and you had a little bit more freedom than in a lot of like set character rules. You got to decide basically Shepard's personality, but ultimately kind of the Shepard's role in the story was the same no matter what you did. I think that does have something to do with it. And then, in the Dragon Age series, they had kind of like a favor-disfavor system with your companions, but party members would get like stat bonuses for really liking you or stat detriments for disliking you. It felt like the game was punishing you instead of like the characters were punishing your character for not doing what they liked.
Right.
So even when you like want to play a character very well in that game, you feel like you kind of have to metagame it a bit just to have a good party that doesn't fall apart.
Yeah. I like that they'll still follow you, though. They'll just be like less enthusiastic about it.
Well, eventually, I think most, maybe not all, but at least most of them can leave if they don't like you enough.
Oh, that's really cool.
And yeah, that is good, I think, that they did that, and but they kind of moved away from that in the future games. Like the latest one, Inquisition, they don't really have like a bar or anything that they track, but if you do something that somebody likes or dislikes, it'll show just a brief thing on the screen, like
Right.
whether they liked or didn't like it, or whether it was small or great impact. And so I think by not really making the impact visible, it helps. And so it just kind of gives you more of a feeling for the types of actions that you're doing. And if you like somebody, maybe you want to try and like align with what they like.
Right.
And sometimes it can be a bit of a moral compass, I guess, depending on who you bond with.
I imagine that has to be like a nightmare to program, like having them be able to leave you because then they can't be essential to the story because you couldn't complete it. Like I think that's another resource thing. Like
Yeah.
it seems like morality systems give you a lot of options, but there's so many more variables. Whereas like in a Final Fantasy, like Barrett's gonna be there the whole time, so it doesn't matter what you say to him. Like, but I was thinking it's kind of funny because thinking back to the first few JRPGs, like Dragon Quest and the original Final Fantasies, they had silent protagonists, and there was like kind of a blank slate for you to emote on,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of interesting that they fell out of favor.
Yeah.
And you started to see more. I think in Final Fantasy 2 there were like specific characters, but that is like by far the least popular one of the whole series. So back to 3, you have these 4 like identical characters who can take on different classes, and you can kind of make them who you want them to be.
I think to a certain extent, when you wanted to start telling more intricate stories, then you had to have more intricate protagonists, and then that's where you have to face this decision where you're either going to make the defined protagonist that the player kind of inhabits, or let the player make the protagonist and make all their decisions.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right because the first Final Fantasy that did it was Final Fantasy 4. And they gave you this character who was a villain and you turned him into a good guy, and that was like his arc alone, even if there were no other characters in the game, was already the most complex thing they'd ever done. And like that change, I think, kind of defined what JRPGs are looked like now, or how the way that they are seen now, like the kind of typical JRPG that you think of, because it's really uncommon to get a silent protagonist now. Like, you know, Link is always going to be silent, probably. You never know
Yeah.
at this point. Like Chrono and Chrono Trigger is like another really famous one, although I hated him in that game. Like I can't do silent protagonists in JRPGs. Like, just talk. Let's just say something. Dragon Quest, I think, still has a silent protagonist, but that's a very like where Final Fantasy always tries to innovate either through the system or the story. They always try to change things up to keep it fresh. Dragon Quest is a lot more classic. Like they keep the same menu, the same font, the same sounds. Like they put a lot of effort into keeping everything feeling like Dragon Quest, and they have a very specific thing that Dragon Quest is supposed to be. Whereas Final Fantasy is kind of an amalgamation of different things.
I can definitely appreciate both of those approaches, I guess. I think it's cool that Final Fantasy, not in like every game, but many of the games, is a completely different set of characters, a completely different world, sometimes completely different combat systems.
Yeah, I really like that, and I think it's funny that people pronounced the death of the series when 13 came out, and I was like, okay, I remember when people were saying that when 8 came out, and that had like weird systems, and it's one of those games where people forget that it's not going to be the same next time. So when one comes out that someone doesn't like, and it could be any of them, it doesn't have to be 13, it could be, I'm sure there were people who didn't like 9 or 8 or whatever. They forget that it's going to change completely the next time around, and they kind of freak out and like, oh, well, Final Fantasy is dead now, like the series is done forever. But like if you look at 10, 11, and 12, like those games came out really close together and they're nothing alike. Like each one of them is really different. They took elements like, 12 has some of the MMO elements from 11 and stuff, but there is so much that's different. And that's why it's almost, sometimes it's like hard to think about JRPGs, because you can think of just Final Fantasy games and there's, 15 completely different games.
Yeah, and I mean, you have other series in JRPGs that mix things up within the series. I mean, if you look at something like SMT and Persona, the main series for SMT is very different from what Persona is.
Oh yeah, the entire vibe is different. The battle system, like there's like connective tissue that makes it feel like an SMT game, but it's like there's so much that makes it feel completely different. The gameplay of that series hasn't changed a ton from the originals, like in terms of the battle system and stuff. but it still feels fresh because they even in that series they always do something to kind of shake it up, and I think Persona was a really big one.
I mean, while we've been talking about this, I've been trying to think, and I don't think that there are a lot of Western RPG series that mix things up quite as much, and usually they reserve that sort of thing for, I guess, a different IP.
Yeah. One of the things that I think JRPGs do that Western don't is that the way they build the world is a little different. And this, I think, is kind of a Japanese storytelling thing. That every world has to have like a hook. Like it's not just a medieval European world. It's, it's a world, but crystals control everything. Or there's a giant tree at the center, and if the tree dies, everyone dies. Like there's always some sort of central conceit that's at the center of the world that they're building. So I think it enables them to make, the world in Final Fantasy VIII and the world in Final Fantasy X could not be more different. But they're very specifically built around kind of these big concepts where I think that in Western RPGs, I mean, obviously you have things like the Star Wars games where you have a bunch of different worlds and stuff, but I think that they're built more around smaller areas that, maybe there's not like some central truth to the world that makes it the way it is, but they focus more on little things like the little towns and the society and things like that. Like I know Dragon Age has a lot of like things about like racism with the elves and the dwarves and things like that.
Yeah.
I think they focus more on those kinds of things because they're usually more open. You're usually exploring more of the world kind of at your own pace. So it's more about discovering stuff about the world, whereas in a JRPG, the villain's going to poison this tree, and if he does, like, all magic's going to disappear and all the butterflies will die, so we have to, like, go fix that.
Yeah, like, not even in a bad way necessarily. JRPGs, I think, try to show you something specific in each one.
Mm-hmm.
Am I allowed to spoil games in this?
Yeah, as long as you say it beforehand.
Okay, well, I'm about to deliver major spoilers for Pillars of Eternity if anybody has not played the game and wants to.
Turn back now.
So you were talking about how each world has its own hook, and that kind of with the years going in my head, and in a lot of ways, the setting they came up with at first seems kind of like generic fantasy because, I mean, you've got like dwarves, elves, and humans. They have a few like races of their own, they have a few class concepts of their own, but then when you get deep into the story, you kind of find the hook is basically like, you have the pantheon of gods, but then the big revelation in the game is that the gods were made by people, because a long time ago, back I guess in a more primitive era, there were a lot of different societies that each had their own sort of ideas of religion, and they engaged in sometimes brutish and horrible rituals or wars over them. And so the most advanced society at the time decided they were going to try and find out which gods the real ones were, and found out that there weren't any. And they were like, it's not like they were trying to do anything bad, but they were just kind of scared shitless by that.
Right. So do you mean they physically made gods, or they just created like the mythology?
They physically made gods, and so the gods are like real things now. You can pray to them, you can get divine favor from them. But they were made by people to basically put an end to religious war, I guess, more, and I guess other horrible practices that went on at the time, like sacrifice.
That's a really interesting idea, that the response to finding out that all religions were wrong is to forcefully manufacture a real one.
Yeah, and so
that's a really cool idea.
Sent out all these missionaries to convert everybody because they had real gods now, so they could prove that they were real with their divine power.
Right.
The main character, in the setting, there's a cycle of rebirth of souls, and so your character has the soul of somebody who was part of the Inquisition at the time all this was happening.
Yeah.
And so as you go through the game, you get all these visions of that life, and basically betraying somebody that was close to you because they found out the truth and were basically like, it's wrong to tell people about this when it's not untrue that there are gods, but everything that they're telling about them is a lie. Right. And she was basically saying that people should be able to make decisions for themselves and find their own identity.
That reminds me a little bit of Final Fantasy X too, and the way that like the religion, like you find out the religion in that game is true, but there's a lot of aspects of it they don't tell to anyone. and you are encouraged not to let anyone know because they think it could like cause a panic and people can't handle the truth.
Yeah, and I
It's
mean,
a similar idea.
as a result of this, I guess, or maybe it just kind of happened naturally, but a lot of the gods, even the ones that seem like they should be pretty cool, have a lot of underhanded or secretive things going on. And so a lot of the plot in both the game and its expansion revolves around kind of digging into these secrets and deciding what you want to do about them.
Right. That's cool. Yeah, like one thing that tends to kind of keep me from Western RPGs is that there isn't some like central hook a lot of the time. Like there's a quest or like a giant world to explore, but I very much connect with like a guided narrative where I want you to tell me like what's the thing that I should be invested in, like what's the thing that you want me to be concerned about. Like I don't do a lot of exploring. And we talked about that a lot when we were talking about Final Fantasy 15
Mm-hmm.
because I don't normally like open worlds. Like Fallout is probably my only open world game, and even then I get like fatigued really fast. Like that was a game where I felt like it had the perfect mix of like some open areas, and then at one point it's like, okay, things just got really serious. You know, it doesn't make sense for you to be running around like going out to lunch at a diner anymore. Like, and I really enjoy that because those are the kind of games that I kind of grew up on. Like, there was a very guided narrative, and even people tend to say that like JRPGs like aren't necessarily linear. I would probably disagree. You don't have to do one thing. It's not like a Mario game where you have one level after another. But in general, if you play Final Fantasy VII 10 times, you're going to do mostly the same thing every time. Like there's some deviations, there's side things you can go do, but generally you're following one central story path, and that just connects to me more. And it's kind of funny because like linearity to me isn't a detriment to a game, and a lot of people
not at all. I think
a lot of people
it's a dirty word
one.
now, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, and I mean I understand that sometimes a game can feel too on rails, and so I think there's something to that. But for me, like when a game is too open, I don't know what to do, and I just have trouble getting really invested in the world because I think I'm used to, and even like because in anime and manga, like I heard a lot of the same thing where people talk about the differences between like Japanese and Western storytelling, is that a lot of anime and manga focus on like really big ideas at the center of what's going on. They may still be really character based, but the worlds that they build are often really convoluted, really complicated. I mean, look at something like Kingdom Hearts, which I will always contend is not as complicated as people say it is, but that doesn't mean it's not complicated. It still is really complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I don't know that most Western games would try to get to that level of complexity. And it's not a good or bad thing. It's just I think Japanese audiences kind of enjoy that really like, I need an encyclopedia to figure out how this world works.
I think that Western RPGs don't necessarily shy away from complexity, but they're very concerned about having someone go in and not really know what's going on. And so it's a lot of the time it's there, and sometimes it's just that they introduce it gradually, or sometimes it's just that it's there but you don't have to pay attention to it if you don't want to in its full detail.
Right. I think there's complexity, but it's more on a micro level than like a macro level where just the world itself has a lot of really weird rules. I think in Western RPGs it's more there's a lot of lore, there's a lot of really complex history, which I think you don't get as much of in JRPGs. Like I know doesn't The Witcher like have like several full-length novels inside it that you can just like spend years reading all the stuff that they wrote in that game that's in game book, that kind of thing.
That's probably true. I mean, that's never a feature I really explored in the game, but I know it's a very detailed setting, and that partly owes due to its history of being a series of books.
Oh, was it a series of books? I didn't know that.
Yeah, there was a few compilations of short stories, and I believe a 5-book series.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I think that's another thing. Like Western RPGs tend to have a lot of lore, like actual history.
Yeah.
Whereas like, a JRPG might have a lot of like, this is what the crystals did and they were related to the gods, and like they have a lot of complex general backstory. But in a game like, Warcraft, you can go back for like centuries and see all the people and like know every bit of that history, which I like. I enjoy reading that
it's
stuff.
kind of interesting because, I mean, thinking of Final Fantasy 15, you learn only the bits of history that you actually need to know, and the rest is either not really explained or just sort of very subtly implied in certain ways.
Yeah, I would argue they took it maybe a little bit too far in that one.
Yeah,
I would
they
have
didn't
liked to know a
explore
little
some
more.
relevant history, but
But yeah, it's
you
definitely more
know,
of a like, this is the world, like, deal with it. And if you want to know more, then buy the Ultimania guide, I guess.
buy our DVD.
Yeah, buy the DVD. Literally, you have to buy a DVD to know the history, but that's a topic that I've been fervently writing about recently. So, but yeah, it's there's a different perspective, I think, to world building, and it's almost hard to put into words. Like, maybe it's just because I'm so used to it. Because like when I talk to people who don't read a lot of anime and manga, and they like try to understand the approach to the world building and the complexity of some of the things, then it occurs to me that the storytelling is kind of different, and that I guess the priorities of the world building are a little bit different. And it's one of those things that unless you really think about, you probably won't even notice, or unless you only play one type of game and then go to another.
Mm-hmm.
Because like that's the thing where like if I play a Western RPG, I'm like, well, like where are the crystals? Like what's running what's running this world? What crazy mythological thing do I have to save? And it's not. A lot of those games aren't
Oh,
like that.
yeah, a lot of the time it's just not there, and it's not even that it's not fantastic. Even high fantasy games have this thing where things mostly work the way you think they do, and if they don't, then it can be explained to you rather simply.
I feel like there's more of a shorthand. Like if you've played like D&D, or you've played a lot of like medieval fantasy games, there's a lot of stuff that they just give you. And I think there's a bonus to that. I think, you shouldn't need to, spend an hour reading about the lore of some place to get into it. But a lot of Western RPGs, because they have a more, I almost want to use the word generic, but in a good way, like because they use a lot of the same tropes, and they're all
Yeah,
kind of
there's a sort of, at least a lot of them have some sort of common foundation.
yeah. And I think that's actually a good thing, because you can get into it and you're like, oh, there are elves. I get what elves are. And then if there's a difference to what you might be expecting from Tolkien elves, they'll kind of give you that, and you can build off of that. But I think after maybe it started with Final Fantasy 7 or even with 6, because that started it kind of going off in a different direction. I think Japanese RPGs kind of left behind the D&D foundation that I think a lot of Western games have kept, in terms of these central concepts and even the central aesthetic. Like even when you get a medieval JRPG, it's often like really weird compared to how we see a medieval story. And it's an interesting departure. And maybe people don't play D&D as much, and so the influence kind of to them, the influence is Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, rather than D&D, which inspired them, and then going further back, Tolkien, which inspired D&D.
Yeah, it could just be that it's almost an outdated influence now.
Mm-hmm. But I do think there's something to that. Like I think it's nice to be able to pick up a game and kind of understand the setting.
Yeah, in some ways it's almost stranger when you come across something that in some ways is simpler but doesn't share a lot of those tropes. Like if you play a fantasy RPG, for better or for worse, you pretty much expect there to be something like an elf or something like a dwarf or whatever.
Right.
And transitioning back over to Tyranny again, that's like a high fantasy game, except for that there's basically nothing except humans, and it's set during like a sort of Bronze Age, Iron Age period. And so that was almost like more unique to me, even though aside from a few things, it's probably closer to almost a semi-historical setting in terms of its tone than something like a Dragon Age or whatever.
Well, I mean, I don't think you need to do much. Like little changes can completely like just flip the script, and I think that's kind of cool. Like you don't necessarily need to create like a complex, like try to make it as little like Tolkien as possible just for the sake of it. Like you can use historical influences, you can use other influences, and people understand it, but you can also make little changes. Like even, is it Dragon Age where the elves are like used as slaves?
Yeah, so they were slaves in like the big empire, and then when the empire got broken apart, they were freed everywhere else, but they're still basically second-class citizens everywhere.
Right. Something like that I think is really cool because it takes something pretty familiar and then just kind of flips it a little bit because elves are always, Tolkien elves are gods. Like they're just
Yeah, I mean,
incredible.
it almost makes you feel bad for them, but then, spoilers for Dragon Age ahead, it turns out that the elves were still the assholes the entire time,
Of course.
because, I mean, the story goes as it is told in the history in the game, which something you figure out is if you play through that series increasingly is that history in that game is completely wrong about a lot of things.
Oh, that's cool.
So the way history is told is that basically the Empire, the big Imperium, to Vinter, came across the Elven Empire and beat them and subjugated them. But what really happened is that the elves were in some sort of war. I don't know if it was like a civil war or something else, but the big war heroes who were very powerful mages fashioned themselves as war heroes, and then following the war when they won, they were then like almost sort of kings or queens, and then eventually they styled themselves as gods, and basically they subjugated their own people into like brutal slavery until one of them rose up and basically started freeing his own people and eventually had to banish all of them, which completely destroyed his civilization.
One of my favorite tropes in fantasy settings is like false history.
Well, then, at least based on sort of a lore perspective, you would really like Dragon Age because that's pretty much one of the central motifs that goes on.
That's awesome.
It seems like a pretty normal fantasy setting when you're just playing like Origins or whatever, but as you keep going through the series, they pull back the curtain a little bit more and more.
Well, I don't know if Fallout really does, but I feel like there's a lot of conflicting stories in Fallout, and there's a lot that we don't know still.
Yeah.
About like how the big war went down and kind of how everything came together after.
Mm-hmm.
I think isn't like in the first game, don't you find out that like the president's a computer or something?
That's in 3, isn't it?
Was it 3? I just spoiled Fallout. It's 10-year-old game, no one cares. If you didn't play it, it's your own fault. Actually, speaking of that, that reminds me of one of the points that you brought up to me that I thought was really interesting, in that the antagonists of like Western RPGs versus JRPGs are a little different.
Yeah.
And in JRPGs, they're kind of more omnipresent. Like you see them, I think, more often. Or sometimes there is more of a central villain. Like sometimes in Western RPGs, there might not be kind of until the end. I think because it tends to be more open, and they don't, you don't want to feel like you're ignoring some dude that's like gonna kill everybody.
Yeah, like if I'm gonna jump between my two good examples, I guess, Tyranny doesn't have like a villain. I mean, you're the villain, I guess. It doesn't have a antagonist necessarily. Basically, I mean, that game has some absurd branching paths, but generally speaking, the antagonist is a few different groups of people, and you have a lot of say in who they're going to be and what order you're going to do things in.
Right.
I'd say one of the games that does a better job of having the omnipresent antagonist is back to Pillars of Eternity. You meet the antagonist in like the first half hour of the game, and they do a good job of not making him show up too much in person, like he's showing up every time you do your laundry or whatever.
Right.
By using the visions I was talking about earlier of your past life when you were in the Inquisition, because he was the head of the Inquisition.
Oh, cool.
And his whole deal is that he was one of the people that founded this religion, and so one of the gods gifted him with the ability to be reborn the same every time he gets reborn, with a perfect memory of all of his past lives.
Well, that's awesome. I want that.
And so he, almost more than being like that goddess's servant, they're kind of like co-conspirators, and he goes throughout different periods of history and manipulates things to benefit both of them.
That's cool. That's really interesting. I am very jealous. That is like my dream.
And so because they have this sort of central narrative thing where you get to see into your own past, so to speak, you get to learn a lot more about him without having to directly interact with him in person, which works given his characters. Specifically, he's so secretive that even somebody who's dedicated their life to trying to unravel the things he does basically still doesn't know anything about him.
Right. I think in JRPGs the villains tend to pop in and out more, but it's really easy to get into like the Team Rocket syndrome.
Yeah.
Where they're just showing up, you defeat them, or like they get away, and it can feel kind of tiring. But I know, like, I think my favorite example, actually, I'm gonna say Final Fantasy VI in the Final Fantasy series is when the villain became like as important as the main characters. Like in Final Fantasy V, like the villain's a tree or something. Like I don't love that game. Like it doesn't like you don't care about him. But like Final Fantasy VI, you have Kefka, who while I don't think he's like the most compelling villain, is a really fun villain. And I think there's this kind of like maybe this isn't as much of like a Japanese thing as I kind of think it is, but I think one of the way that they design characters, and you know, obviously this is just a theory, but I think it's influenced to some degree by manga, because the reason like characters have like crazy colored hair and spiky hair and stuff in manga is because they need it for the cover. Like every month or every week or month, like a character will be featured on the cover of a magazine, and there's a lot of competition. There are a lot of manga magazines. And so you make someone you want to stand out. You want someone to say, oh, cool, the guy looks really cool. Let me pick up that thing and watch it. So you want the villains to be kind of the same way. And I think that there's a concentration on making villains look really interesting and like making them kind of cool. Like you see in character polls all the time that they do in manga that the villain is always in the top 5. I don't know. I think there's just an approach to making the villains where they need to be really cool and charismatic, and there's someone that you want to see over and over again. Like Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII, from the moment that you meet him, he's a presence for the rest of the game. Like he's sending clones after you all the time. He's always showing up. You never go too long without seeing him in some way.
I think that this is my opinion, but I think if you're going to have one sort of central antagonist, automatically probably going to be the most important character after the main character.
Yes, absolutely.
And so you can't, and this is one of the things that annoys me when it happens, you can't have them basically never show up, because then you've created and put a lot of effort into developing this really compelling character because they're so important to the story, and then you basically never utilize them.
JRPG villains tend to be really flashy. Like, I know a lot of, they tend to get, especially Final Fantasy villains, tend to get a lot of flack for being really, like, effeminate and, like, dressing really crazy, but I think that's absolutely on purpose. I think it's to make them like visually appealing.
Yeah, you need them to stand out almost more than anyone else.
Yeah, I don't know. I think they're just supposed to be a little more eye grabbing, whereas maybe in Western games there's a focus more on what their plan is or kind of the actual character. Or not to say that in a JRPG there's no character, but
especially in the games where they don't show up a lot or even enough, in my opinion, you don't see them a lot, so the focus is on either their subordinates or just what they're trying to do. And I mean, sometimes there's cool minions, but one of my big complaints with a lot of Western RPGs is how they handle their antagonists.
I think that's another like open world thing too. It's really hard to have a central threat if you don't know when your player is going to be hitting like point A, B, or C.
Or, you know, if you do like the Fallout 4 thing, then you have a central threat and it kind of ruins the immersion to a large degree.
Yeah, I have a save of that game just sitting there, and like I need to go save that kid, but like there's all this other stuff to do, and like on the one hand I want to go do all these side quests because what if I miss something really cool, but on the other hand like I want to go do the main quest because there's no reason I shouldn't be doing it, and that's another like paralyzed by choice thing, and I just do nothing. I just don't play the game for months at a time.
Yeah, my approach with a game like that, because there's so much stuff to do, is basically to not try doing anything in particular.
Right.
And just kind of go where your whim decides you should go.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach.
Because I recently started playing Dragon's Dogma again, which is a game I dropped for kind of similar reasons. It's also hard to get specific things done in that game because you have to walk basically everywhere.
Yeah.
But then I started playing and I'm just like, I'm gonna do this quest and then walk in this direction and just kind of wander around. And It's been a lot more enjoyable since I did that, because now I don't feel like I'm pressured to figure out how things work faster than I am going to learn them naturally.
Right. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that game is Japanese developed.
Yes, I believe it's Capcom.
But I think it's kind of like Dark Souls in that to most people it feels more like a Western game. Or it feels like a Japanese take on a Western game.
Yeah, like if you handed it to someone and didn't tell them where it came from, it would probably be split, but there would be a lot more people saying it was Western than you would think from any other RPG.
Yeah. I think that goes back to the idea that even though technically the only real difference between a JRPG and a Western RPG is their point of origin, there is something like in the sensibilities of storytelling and in the sensibilities of even design that, and maybe it's just association, maybe it's not, maybe it's not real, but like there's a feeling that you get. Like Bravely Default doesn't feel like any game that I feel like has been developed here, unless it was like specifically trying to go after that kind of Final Fantasy archetype.
No, and I think a lot of the things you have said about JRPGs does ring true for Dragon's Dogma, with how the setting is less historically developed but has more interesting and strange central concepts behind the world itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I obviously haven't finished it, but that's kind of the vibe I'm getting. You don't really know a lot about the history or like the people, but there's definitely something strange going on here because, you know, this dragon just shows up and steals your heart, but you're cool, and then that means you're supposed to go fight it.
Is that the plot? I know nothing about Dragon's Dogma.
I mean, I'm sure it gets weirder, but that's the plot so far, basically. Oh, and then there are these things called pawns from the Rift, and you know, they're not people even though they look like people, and they help you because, you know, you got your heart stolen. And so that's just like the first 30 minutes, so this game's crazy right off the bat.
Right.
But then I guess in terms of the way it plays, it's very Western in the sense that, like, it's about running around the world and kind of doing, like, D&D adventure simulator things.
Right.
You explore dungeons, you fight some dragons, you have a party of people with different classes and abilities, and it's got a sort of, you know, muddy medieval aesthetic that's common to a lot of Western medieval RPGs.
Oh yeah, didn't even mention color. I think that's a huge thing. Like,
yeah,
there's so much more color in JRPGs, and for some people it's totally obnoxious. For me, it is like a requirement. Like, I need like neon, just explosions of color everywhere, or else I zone out.
I think, I mean, yeah, there's definitely a history of at least muted color palettes in Western RPGs.
I think it's just like realistic.
But I think at a certain point, like, it may have been like when Fallout 3 hit and everything was brown and gray. Like, literally everything was brown or gray.
I think it was like a PS3 and Xbox 360 thing.
And that may have been the point where people were like, you know, we kind of like the realistic toned down color palettes, but you can use color. It's something that exists.
Yeah.
And so you've seen more color in more recent RPGs, like even in the upcoming sequel to Pillars of Eternity, they said they're trying to bring a bit more bright colors into it. Not like over the top, but more than they had before. If you look at like Dragon Age Inquisition over Origins, I mean, partly it's the technology, but also there's just a lot more really beautiful color in the game.
Didn't the Diablo team get like blasted when they put out the first few Diablo 3 screenshots and they were like too colorful? And I understand that there's a specific kind of aesthetic and mood to that game, so it's not exactly the same. But I just thought it was funny because I saw it and I was like, that looks beautiful. That's a game I want to play. But everyone was like, no, this is stupid. Like, there's too much color. And I was like, no, don't. This is how bad things happen. Like,
I don't know. I do not play Diablo a lot myself. I think it's probably the appropriate amount of colorful now, based on the most recently I played. Because, it's got... I don't even know how to describe its aesthetic, but it's got a very specific aesthetic.
Yeah, it has an aesthetic. I feel like sometimes... And not as much now, but there was definitely a period where kind of like not huge name games would come out, and maybe it's just my fatigue. Like, I just kind of got fatigued with kind of the typical medieval setting. If I can make a bunch of people really angry all at once, I think Skyrim is one of the most drab and boring looking games ever made.
I hate actually
the aesthetic
agree.
Of that game so bad. It's all like gray, there's like snow and then rocks, and like that's it. And I would watch my roommate play and I was like, everything looks the same. And like, I like watching someone play that game because a lot of interesting stuff happens. I couldn't. Like, I tried for like 10 minutes and I was just like, I'm bored. I want to go play something.
There are like a handful of areas in that game that are visually beautiful.
Yeah.
but especially in the interiors, everything is, and a lot of the, I guess, more nondescript exterior locations, things are just kind of boring, and I get that that's the aesthetic for that region, but it's kind of dull to me.
Yeah, Fallout kind of gets away with it because there was a nuclear apocalypse. Although it's been so many years past the apocalypse at this point where most Fallout games take place, like most people wouldn't still be wearing rags. People know how to sew. Like that's one thing that always made me mad. This is a tangent. There's one thing that always makes me real mad about Fallout. Even though I like the aesthetic of like post-apocalyptic stuff's kind of just hammered together and they're just trying to make it work. Like that's fine the first like 5 years after a nuclear fallout. Like you would sew that hole in your pants after a couple years, or you would just make new pants. And I get that it's like part of the thing, but like that always made me really mad. But in those games, because everything's like blasted to hell, it feels okay to have things. But even Fallout 4, I feel like, was a little more colorful.
Yeah, they tried, especially in Boston itself.
Yeah. I think it's definitely something that we're moving away from. I am convinced that the Xbox 360 and PS3 were when that happened. And I think it was partially the modern military shooters' faults.
Yes.
Not to, those games are fine. It's not my game, but I'm fine with them. I'm not trying to like be like, oh, Call of Duty sucks. Like Call of Duty's fine, whatever. It's super popular. Clearly people like it. But the color palettes in those games, and I think it fits, but it's very drab.
Yeah,
and I think because those games are so popular, someone in a boardroom, making Kingdoms of Amalur or whatever, was like, oh, that's the color palette. If you're a sci-fi game, your color palette is blue and orange. If you're a medieval game, color palette is gray and brown.
Yeah, I played a lot of Call of Duty 4 because before I played RPGs, that was kind of the sort of thing I did. And I liked that game, but it was like muted blues, gray, and green, and that was literally it.
Yeah.
And I think that was just kind of a trend for a while, like Gears of War 2. And I mean, that is also a game where that was just kind of the aesthetic, but then I think it caught on because of how popular that game was.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where the context doesn't matter once it becomes popular.
Yeah.
Like, Call of Duty is not the same as, whatever RPG franchise, like any RPG franchise, unless it's set in a similar kind of setting. Like, I think those games, especially, like, maybe not if it's, like, kind of low fantasy and there's, like, not a lot of magic or whatever, but in a game where there's magic, like, there should be color. Like, World of Warcraft has always gotten a lot of flack for, like, its cartoony art style, but I think that at the very least, if it's not your style,
super
it's not your
visually
style.
distinctive. It's...
Yeah. Like, I mean, if you don't like it, you don't like it. But I think that it's a very designed world. Like, everything is designed to be visually appealing. Everything's designed to be unique. I was trying to pinpoint, because I was thinking about how much I hate isometric games. And a lot of Western RPGs are isometric. I don't know, for some reason, and the minute I see that a game is isometric, it just takes me out of it. And it shouldn't, like, even if it still looks really good, something about that perspective, and part of it, I was thinking, is the distance from the character.
Yeah, I was about to say, knowing you, it might be that it's just a little bit too impersonal.
Yes, absolutely. Because even when I play MMOs, my camera, when we are playing Final Fantasy 14, is like right up my character's butt. Like, they take up, and my character's not tall. Like, my character takes up most of the screen, unless we're raiding. And that drives me crazy when I see like World of Warcraft videos or like Final Fantasy 14 videos.
They're zoomed all the way out.
To me, that's not fun. Even though I understand that, like, objectively is better because you can see everything that's going on. To me,
yeah,
it's just
but it's
not,
like, we both
like
played this game together, and I'm kind of of the same mind in this case. We customized our characters to look great, so we want to look at ourselves because we look great.
Yeah, and it's just like it's one of those things. Like the character models in isometric games tend to be more realistic, and they tend to be, I don't know if I would say less detailed, but something about them and the way they move like freaks me out.
I mean, one of the legitimate criticisms of like Pillars of Eternity is that a lot of the characters, just due to the animations and both technological and time and budget constraints, a lot of them didn't really feel that alive.
Right.
Like, not even that the animation quality was especially poor, but they couldn't add a lot of the flourishes that kind of bring stuff to life, and that's one of the big things they've been saying about the sequels, that we're going to, add more animations, make them better.
Right.
They're just a lot of the technological improvements they've had when they aren't aimed strictly like making things run better, which was another problem they had. Whenever they're visually improving something, it's because they want things to feel more alive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in more open games like that, that's essential.
I mean, I love that game a lot, but if you go into the city, it's dense and there's a lot of stuff there, but it's all very static.
Right. I think in general, like, I think this is how you can see my sensibilities as a weeb trash person. Is that, like, to me, when I see the lineup of characters from a game, if like all of them have like really normal hair color and just armor and stuff, I'm like, that's boring. But if like they look all like the characters need to look crazy, I think it's that like Japanese like manga sensibility of like every character needs to be not only distinct but like crazy. Like you need to be able to pick them out from any crowd. And I feel like that's one thing that JRPGs give me is like crazy characters, and sometimes they go a little too far. But then to me, like if you show me like a character from Dragon Age Inquisition, I'm like, oh, that's like a background NPC to me. Just because I'm used to like flamboyant characters. And it's just like a taste thing that I've been conditioned for like magical girls, and like when I just get like some lady in a dress, I'm like, where's her
I mean,
like
one
star
of the
baton?
things that does alleviate this problem in like an isometric game, for example, is when you're in dialogue, they'll have character portraits show up so you can get a close up of them.
Yeah, that I like. I just like, and there are games that I know for sure that I would love the story of, but